Hello, and welcome. Tonight, as the day settles and silence finds your room, I want to invite you to come just as you are. Here, you are not alone. There is space to rest, to listen, and maybe even smile a little. Right there where routine and worry meet at the edge of bedtime. Have you ever felt caught between what you wish you could be and what you actually are? Between a strength everyone else sees and a tiredness that only you feel? There is a story, old as stone, about Samson the Strong's T-man in the world, chosen before birth, and yet so human that at times he tripped over his own feet just like the rest of us. Tonight, we walk with Samson, from the wild childhood that nobody quite understood, to the moments when even the mighty needed to whisper for help in the dark. So, get comfortable. Let these moments belong to you. As you journey with us, maybe you'll find a piece of your own longing stitched into the fabric of his story, the hope of being found in weakness, not just and victories. If you are moved by these stories, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe, so you never miss a night like this. And if you wish, leave a gentle word for others who might wander through, because sometimes the smallest spark of hope can light more than one soul. Now, let's begin and see what happens between strength and vulnerability, under the watchful kindness of a God who never misses a thing, even if the world thinks we're the strongest or the most lost. Long ago, in a small, quiet sea, corner of the land, there lived a couple whose days blurred together with chores and whispered prayers. They dreamed, but their arms were empty and their hopes wore thin from waiting. One ordinary afternoon, as the shadows stretched a bit longer and the dust settled on their doorstep, the air grew heavy with something unexplainable. Suddenly, a stranger appeared, glowing with a light that had nothing to do with the sun. The woman's eyes widened. She wanted to run, but found herself rooted like an olive tree in her own yard. The stranger's voice was gentle, almost amused by her shock. "Don't be afraid," he said quietly. "You will have a son. He will be different from all the others. Even while you carry him, he will be set apart for something only he can do." She blinked, hoping this was a dream, a strange one, but better than most. "Why me? Why now?" she whispered, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Because hope has a way of sneaking up, even in the most unlikely places." The stranger smiled, and it seemed as if heaven itself was in on the secret. "Your son will begin to set your people free from their enemies. But remember, no razor shall ever touch his head, for he is chosen from the very start." When her husband came home, he found his wife staring into the evening, both terrified and filled with wonder. "Why are you smiling like that?" he asked, a little suspicious, as husbands often are when something marvelous is about to happen to someone else. She replied, her voice trembling, "We are not forgotten. We are going to have a child, one the world won't easily forget." And on that quiet evening, hope bloomed suddenly, strangely, right in the middle of their waiting. A promise had been planted, and it would grow, messy and mysterious, just as real as the laughter and tears that were sure to follow. When at last the promise took shape and breath, a cry echoed through the house, small yet fierce, as if the newborn was already announcing to the world, "Make some room. Something unusual has arrived." His mother held him close, amazed that her arms were no longer empty, and marveled at the weight of a miracle she could count right down to the tiny toes. She named him Samson, a name that sat heavy in her mouth, both a song and a secret. His father peered at his son as if expecting to see lightning flicker in his eyes or hear thunder in his voice. But Samson was just a baby, all soft fists and hungry wails, reminding everyone that even the extraordinary have diapers and restless nights. Friends and neighbors came by, peeking in with the usual advice, the wisecracks, and the suspicious side-eye that only small towns can perfect. "He looks strong," one muttered, as the baby clutched at his mother's finger with a surprising grip. "Careful, he might break your heart and your broom." Every day brought both joy and a hint of worry. His mother watched for any sign, any glimpse of the special she'd been promised, while his father tried to memorize prayers that might help him keep up with a child destined for more than just chasing goats or losing sandals by the stream. At night, the parents would lie awake and whisper, "Do you think he'll always be this loud?" the father asked, half laughing. "I hope so," she replied softly. "I'd rather have loud miracles than silent regrets." Together, they held their son between awe and anxiousness, knowing stories had already begun whispering about his birth. It was the start of something grand, though. As they would soon learn, extraordinary adventures usually come with extraordinary messes. But for now, there was room only for soft light, new hope, and the wonder of a child whose life, even in this small moment, was already far from ordinary. Samson's childhood was many things, but quiet was not one of them. Long before he could walk, the neighbors whispered and joked that he'd grow up to wrestle thunderclouds, just for fun. By the time he was old enough to run, Samson was already making leggings for himself, whether he meant to or not. He would lift baskets heavier than himself, leaving the village women muttering impossible under their breath while they pinched their own arms just to be sure they were awake. Occasionally, a donkey or goat would wander too close, and Samson, barely reaching its shoulders, would push it aside as if it were a wayward sack of onions. The animals stopped challenging him soon enough. Really, everyone did. Some nights, Samson would wake up out of bed, his little brow furrowed with dreams he couldn't explain. He'd tell his mother, "The stars were chasing me," or "I heard a lion laughing." She smiled and stroked his hair, never sure if she should laugh along or find a way to shoo the mysteries out the window. But the dreams always returned, full of riddles and roaring creatures, victories and shadows. Sometimes, he would sit in the middle of the yard, eyes wide and thoughtful, asking strange questions no one could answer. "Why do I feel so strong and so small at the same time?" he wondered aloud, tossing a rock from hand to hand as if waiting for it to answer. Other children watched from a distance, whispering stories and daring each other to touch his shadow. Some days they tried to be his friends, other days they simply hid anything valuable when he came around. It's hard to be included when one accidental hug might flatten your playmate's favorite toy. His parents loved him with a mix of pride and a little terror, watching as the line between normal and miraculous wore thin with each sunrise. This was Samson, unusual, unexplainable, and already carrying dreams too big for any bedtime story. It didn't take long before Samson realized he was not like the other children. When he joined their games, a ripple of uncertainty always followed. Mothers pulled their little ones just a bit closer. Fathers, watching from doorways, raised an eyebrow, sometimes both, especially after Samson once broke a swing with nothing but an enthusiastic push. He noticed the way people looked at him, eyes wide, conversations falling silent, a cautious shuffle of feet whenever he approached. Little hands hid favorite toys as Samson came nearer, not because he meant harm, but because last time someone's wooden cart ended the day in splinters rather than in one piece. Even the village dog, brave enough to chase foxes and shadows, would relocate if Samson reached for its ears. Some days, Samson thought, maybe if I tried to be quieter, someone different, then they would understand me. He spent hours staring into puddles, his reflection just as confusing as theirs, the water swirling with questions. His mother saw the sadness in his eyes, the storm behind his smile. One night, he asked her, "Why do I make people nervous, even when I do nothing wrong?" She drew him close and whispered, People are scared of what they can't explain, Samson. They see your strength, but not your heart. Give them time. And if all else else, just don't try to fix any more doors for Mr. Levi. He chuckled, despite himself, remembering how Mr. Levi's door now swung the wrong way and twice as fast. Sometimes he felt like a joke, only he understood. Still, there was a loneliness in his growing bones, an ache for friends who didn't flinch, for someone who would see past the muscles and the whispered stories. Yet when he lay in bed under a blanket of restless dreams, something deep down reminded him that different wasn't the same as alone. It was just a story waiting for its next surprising chapter. As the years rolled on and Samson's feet outgrew his sandals more times than his mother cared to count, he noticed things about himself that others simply couldn't match. Lifting heavy things wasn't just easy, it felt normal, almost like an itch he needed to scratch. Sometimes he'd stack rocks just to see how high they'd go. He didn't know if he was building towers or just carving out reasons for villagers to stare a little long. Mischief seemed to stick to Samson like stray straw to a shepherd's cloak. Once, he tried to juggle 3 clay pots and, when those inevitably shattered, declared to his mother, "At least now we know pottery wasn't my calling." She tried to be stern, but the laughter always won in the end. Yet, behind the laughter, Samson felt a quiet tug, a sense that the world was waiting for him to step into some story bigger than jokes and competitions. At night, when the moon painted silver on the walls, he would remember the words whispered to him about a promise made long before he'd taken his first breath. "Samson, you're here for a reason," his father would tell him, voice low with something like awe or maybe caution. "There are things only you're meant to do." The thought left Samson restless. Was he supposed to feel so ordinary on the outside and yet carry something so weighty inside? He wanted to do right, but temptation loved to play games. Races he wasn't supposed to win, apples he wasn't supposed to pick, adventures a little farther from home each day. Sometimes when he got in trouble, he'd flash that crooked grin, the one that nearly got him out of punishment every single time. But deep down, Samson knew his story wasn't just about being the strongest or the most clever at getting away with pranks. It was about learning that being called often meant being curious, and that sometimes humility begins with being the only kid in town who can accidentally knock down a once by leaning against it a little too hard. Strength, as Samson was quickly learning, wasn't all it was cracked up to be. At first, lifting what others could not brought playful praise and large-eyed wonder. But the older he grew, the more his strength separated him from the world he longed to fit into. It was one thing to impress the neighbors by hauling water in jars as big as a calf. It was something else entirely when he'd break the handle off again and watch his mother sigh as she mental. Why added another repair to her list? More than once, Samson tried to hold back. He would pick up a loaf of bread as gently as he could, only to watch it crumble like dirt between his fingers. A friendly arm wrestle with his cousin ended in sore feelings and a bent stool. And let's not talk about the time he tried to help his father in the fields. The plow hasn't been the same since. It wasn't just physical strength that weighed on him. Samson's desires burned as hot as the desert sun, and summity just as dangerously. If he saw something he wanted, a piece of honeycomb, a new path through the hills, answers to questions no one else asked, he chased after it with all the stubborn force bottled up inside him. But this strength made him restless, even in his own skin. When he wanted to be gentle, he was clumsy. When he tried to be patient, impatience snuck in like a fox, stealing his calm in the quiet hours. He was legendary in the village for having a heart as big as his biceps, but both could lead him into trouble faster than anyone could intervene. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Samson sat alone, picking at a splinter from a broken chair he hadn't meant to break. Most people only have to worry about falling out of a chair, he muttered. I have to worry about taking it down with me. His strength was a gift, but at times it felt like an oversized coat he could never quite shrug off. And with each passing day, Samson wondered quietly if he was meant to carry this weight alone, or if just maybe his burdens would one day make sense. It was inevitable that Samson's growing world would eventually cross paths with the Philistines, their territory looming just over the hills, their soldiers parading like roosters, all feathers and noise. The first encounter was nothing dramatic, just Samson and his father bringing goods to a nearby town. But even from a distance, there was something about the Philistines that felt itchy. You know, that peculiar feeling, when you know trouble is sizing you up from the other side of the street. Samson tried not to stare too long, yet he couldn't help but marvel at their polished armor, their loud laughter that sounded a bit too forced, and the way they looked back at him with smug curiosity, as if searching for something to mock. One Philistine nudged another and whispered, "Is that the strong one we've heard about? He doesn't look like much." Samson grinned and thought, if only you saw the pottery at my house. Nothing about the Philistines seemed gentle or trustworthy, not even their smiles. Everything about them said, let's cause a stir and blame someone else if things get messy. As the day went on, the tension followed Samson like a shadow, amplifying every odd glance and staged compliment. He noticed how the Philistines always stood in groups, thick as thieves, puffing themselves up with stories about conquest and luxury, another noticing how much they were disliked by everyone else. Promise you won't get involved, his father whispered as they packed up, aware of that spark in Samson's eyes. I promise to try, Samson replied, not quite convincing anyone, least of all himself. It was the sort of moment that felt sour even before anything happened, the kind where you just knew nothing good would come out the other end. Later, as they walked home, Samson shook his head. I think they're waiting for a chance to start something, he said. His father snorted, or to learn how to fix furniture from you. Heaven help us. So it was with the Philistines, a clash waiting to happen, tinged with comedy and inevitability, as if the universe itself couldn't decide whether to roll its eyes or hold its breath. Just when everyone thought Samson's life couldn't get any more unpredictable, he saw her bright-eyed, sharp-witted, a Philistine woman dressed in colors that dared anyone to look away. Samson, with all his impossible strength, found himself tripping over words, heart-pounding, he'd just run up a mountain. All the old stories warn against this sort of thing. Don't fall for the one on the other side. Don't mix strength with temptation. Don't try to pick wildflowers out of a lion's mouth, but try telling that to a young man who has never fit in anywhere, who finds himself seen, really seen, by someone unexpected. He raced home faster than a rumor and declared to his stunned parents, I have met the one. She's incredibly, and yes, she's a Philistine. Silence, then 100 unspoken questions hovering in the air quicker than they could blink. His mother winced. His father tried to find the right words. Samson, have you thought this through? I know what I want, Samson replied, as if that ever guaranteed anything but more confusion. The neighbors shook their heads, the way villagers do when they've seen enough young love to know better. Some muttered, couldn't he have fallen for the baker's daughter? At least she comes with bread. But Samson's G paid no attention to logic, and certainly not to convenient geography. For once, here was someone who didn't flinch when he reached for her hand, who smiled at his strength and answered his jokes with a sharper one of her own. Still, the village braced for trouble, the kind that only happens when heart meets boundary, and tradition tries to argue with destiny. Samson's story was tilting toward the dangerous and the ridiculous with every step. Typical, someone might say. Of course, the Strongs, T-man in the land, would be conquered, at least a little, by the promise in someone else's eyes. And in this quiet uproar, the next chapter of tension and tangled hearts began. Because nothing ever gets simple when love crosses lines drawn by old fears. If you've ever tried to talk sense into someone in love, you know just what Samson's parents were up against. They paced at the hearth, wringing their hands and trading worried whispers. His mother, always hoping her son would choose wisely, found herself short on comforting words. His father collected arguments like pebbles, each one swiftly brushed aside. "Son, isn't there a woman among our own people?" his father pleaded, voice straining somewhere between hope and exasperation. "Does it have to be a Philistine?" But Samson only looked more determined, as if every word of concern was a stone on the path he would gladly move aside. "Get her for me," he insisted gently, a stubborn twinkle in his eye, "for she is right in my eyes." His mother tried another angle. "She doesn't share your ways, your God. Life will be hard, Samson. Won't you consider?" He shrugged, managing to look both bashful and headstrong. "Sometimes the heart chooses what it chooses." His parents shared that look, the one that says, "We lost this battle before we even began." Perhaps it's a universal rule. The stronger the child, the harder it is to change their mind. With Samson, logic was no match for longing, reason a distant cousin to romance. That night, his mother sat beside her husband and whispered, "Maybe some lessons are learned the slow way." He nodded, remembering his own youthful follies. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe our son is about to teach us one." So with uncertain hearts and prayers slipping quietly into the darkness, they watched as Samson moved toward the unknown, not because they approved, but because sometimes love and destiny are forces even stronger than a mother's sigh or a father's well-meant warning. On his way to visit the woman who'd stolen his heart, Samson found himself face to face with something a lot hairier and far less charming, a young lion prowling in the vineyard, teeth bared and eyes glinting. Most people would have run. Samson, on the other hand, met danger like an old friend. The Spirit of God rushed over him, and before he knew it, the lion was defeated, left on the roadside as quickly as it had appeared. Days later, curiosity got the better of him, a habit that would get him in more trouble than lions ever could. Returning to the spot, he found something truly odd. Inside the carcass, bees had built a hive, dripping with golden honey. Samson grinned, plucked out a handful, and tasted sweetness from a place no one would dare look. Strange fortune honey from a riddle written in muscle and miracle. Later, at his wedding feast, surrounded by Philistines eager to turn up their noses at him, Samson couldn't help himself. "Let me offer you a riddle," he announced, his smile sly as a fox. "Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet." The guests muttered among themselves, confidence turning to confusion as the days dragged by. "What's strong? What's sweet? Is he talking about his mother's stew?" one joked. But none could solve it, and frustration grew with every guess. The wager was steep, expensive clothes, pride, and the joy of seeing the local troublemaker outsmarted. But the riddle was more than a game. It was a line boldly crossed, a whisper of the Nasian weaving through every celebration, every laugh that hid a challenge, every smile masking suspicion. When you put a feast, a grudge, and a baffling riddle in one room, the only thing guaranteed is trouble. Samson, with honey still on his fingers and a mischievous glint in his eyes, watched it all unfold, half hoping someone would guess, half hoping they never would. It started small, as these things often do, a harsh word here, a bruised ego there. and the echo of Samson's riddle bouncing Philistine pride, like pebbles on a tiled roof. Frustration brewed beneath the wedding feast's laughter. The guests grew restless, their wagers on the line and their patience slipping. More than one looked at Samson as if he were the lion this time, waiting to pounce, while others whispered suspicions in the corners. Unable to solve his riddle, the Philistines began to plot. They cornered Samson's bride, pressing her for answers, their voices low and sharp. If anyone thought love could unla the mess, they were in for a disappointment. When she, caught between fear and loyalty, wept and pleaded, Samson found himself less a groom and more the target of a trap cleverly disguised as a party. By the end of the feast, secrets had traded hands quicker than wine goblets. Tempers flared, old grudges found new fuel, and by nightfall, the whole town seemed to be trading stories about that Hebrew troublemaker. It was said with a mix of awe, irritation, and just a hint of admiration for W. Who else could append a festival and keep everyone guessing without even breaking a sweat? Samson's fame grew, for better or worse. Some admired his wit, others bemoaned the headaches he caused. Fights simmered just under the surface, sparked by rumors, jealousy, and the stubbornness that seemed to cling to him like pollen in spring. His mother sighed, "There's never a quiet moment with him," as she patched yet another torn cloak. His father only muttered, if only he'd stick to riddles and avoid wrestling with half the town. But it was too late. Samson's name was already etched in every conversation, every squabble. He had accidentally become a legend and a headache all at once. The sort of man you watched with half a smile and half a prayer, hoping that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be a little less exciting. What should have been a joyful celebration quickly unraveled into a knot of suspicion and daring bets. The guests, frustrated by Samson's unsolvable riddle and desperate no tea to lose, face or expensive tunics grew bold. They pressured his bride, who in turn pressured Samson, asking for the answer with the persistence of rain in the dry season. A husband's secret became a weapon in someone else's hands. When the answer finally spilled, forth wrested from Samson by tears and pleading word, travelled faster than spilled wine. The Philistines returned his riddle in smug voices. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? Samson knew in an instant he'd been tricked. His jaw clenched, a cold smile flickered. The joy in his eyes darkened into challenge. If you hadn't ploughed with my heifer, you wouldn't have solved my riddle, he bit out. A line that gave the gossips enough to talk about for weeks. His pride hurt, his trust in shambles. Samson stormed out from the festivities and into the waiting world, but the bet was still on. Without so much as a sigh, he marched to a neighboring Philistine town and, in a feat of swift fury, gathered the garment. TSO'd. It wasn't exactly polite. The rumor traveled. Samson wedding crasher, riddle master, and now local legend for unconventional debt collection. The wedding feast, once sparkling with laughter and dreams, had dissolved into raised voices, bruised egos, and the heavy air of betrayal. Trust was a scarce commodity, and alliances shifted as quickly as Samson's mood. His parents watched from a distance, his mother with worry, his father with equal parts dread and disbelief. Leave it to Samson to turn a party into history. Everyone else just waited, breath held, to see what spectacle would unfold next. For wherever Samson went, mischief seemed to travel close behind, and peace was always the first thing to leave the room. In the aftermath of feasts and wagers, something far heavier settled over Samson, a sharp, aching sense of betrayal. He'd thought winning his wife's heart was difficult. Keeping it safe from the swirl of schemes around them had been impossible. The Philistines, clever and cruel, had pressed her until she broke. prying secrets free with threats and fear disguised as friendship. When Samson discovered the truth, it was as if every laugh they'd shared turned hollow, every promise faded into a shadow. Worse still, his wife was taken from him entirely, given away by her own people to someone Samson could barely remember from the guest list, the sort of neighbor whose only real talent was being in the right place at the wrong time. It seemed the whole village, inspired to turn his story from celebration to sorrow in less than a week. Samson's anger, potent and quick, blazed out of the loneliness now taking root deep inside him. If this is how they repay kindness, he muttered, fists clenched and jaws set, then let them see just how strong sorrow can be. The world, already too small for his heart, grew even smaller and sharper, lined with suspicion and regret. He walked the roads alone, passing houses where laughter did not follow him and doors close. Ed a little faster than before. Those he once trusted now faded into the sideline, leaving only the memory of their voices and the sting of their silence. In that isolation, Samson felt his strength twist into something colder. What could muscles fix in a world that broke hearts so easily? The mighty can break things, yes, but loneliness, sharp and silent, does its damage without a sound. Beneath it all, there lingered a stubborn ache for something truer. Friend, a home, a simple evening where jokes weren't riddles and trust wasn't a gamble. But the night stretched long, and the only answer that came was the echo of his own footsteps, heavy, solitary music for the strongest man who could not outlift his own aching soul. Samson was never one to take betrayal lying down, especially not when the sting was still fresh. Instead of stewing in silence, he did something only Samson would think of. He rounded up 300 foxes. Yes, foxes. Wild, quick, and as untamable as his own fury. Ching just one would tire most people. Samson, propelled by wounded pride and a taste for mischief, corralled them like someone gathering laundry before a rainstorm. He tied them tail to tail, a torch fastened between each pair, and set the torches alight before letting the foxes loose in the Philistine fields. Imagine it. Startled foxes zigzagging through golden wheat and ripening vineyards, torches trailing chaos behind them. In moments, fields caught fire, flames leaping from crop to crop, black smoke rising in plumes that turned day to dusk. The shouts of panicked farmers and the bewildered cries of townsfolk filled the air, symphony of confusion unleashed by one man's broken trust. Somewhere in the mayhem, someone must have shouted, who thought anger could sprint on 4 legs, while another surely cursed the day they ever made Samson angry. Messy, absolutely. But the message could not have been clearer. He would not be toyed with, not by love, not by betrayal, not by a commune. Nitty comfortable with backroom deals and easy dismissals. Of course, such theatrics only turned up the heat. Relationships that were already strained snapped altogether, and any hope for reconciliation smoldered alongside the ruined harvest. The Philistines now hated Samson with a passion matched only by their scorched fields. But in the middle of it all, you could almost hear the foxes cackling, a wild, mad sort of laughter only animals and broken-hearted heroes really understand. Samson watch the flames dance in the night, a grim satisfaction settling over him. Strength sends a message, but sometimes it's heartache fierce and foolish that really sets the world on fire. After the flames died down and the shouts faded into wary silence, Samson withdrew to the solitude of a rocky hilly place where the world's noise was just a distant hum. It wasn't triumph he carried with him up there, but something heavier, pride battered by betrayal and the ache of longing for what he'd lost. The ill overlooked the land below, patchwork fields now scarred by fire, and scattered homes where laughter felt far away. Alone, Samson sat with only the wind for company and memories swirling like dust around his feet. In that hardness of the rock, he found a reflection of his own heart, tough on the surface, but cracked by recent events. He tried to convince himself that striking back had fixed something, but all he really had was emptiness, echoing like a song half remembered but never quite finished. He replayed moments he wished he could change: the laughter of his wife before lies stole her away, the warmth of a village that once pretended to call him neighbor. "Look at me now," Samson said to the gathering dusk, voice just a little wry. The mighty Samson, hero of burned fields and lonely rocks. Even he had to smirk at the irony. For all his victories, he couldn't wrestle away the simple pain of missing someone or undo the ruin left behind. Pride insisted he was better off alone, untouchable and free. Yet every so often, between thoughts, a sliver of tenderness broke through the memory of affection. The wish for a world that didn't turn so easily to smoke and spite. He wondered if it was possible to be strong on the outside, but soft enough inside to still care. The wind answered only with silence, as if the whole world knew what he tried not to admit. Even the strongest heart bends under the weight of missing what was dear. So Samson sat high above the world, held between in stubborn pride and aching loss, waiting, though he would never admit it, for someone or something to reach through the distance and remind him that vengeance is a poor substitute for comfort, and that even legends sometimes need to be found. It wasn't long before word of Samson's fiery reprisal raced far beyond the fields, carried on every anxious tongue in Judah. The Philistines, red-faced and ready for revenge, swept into the region with an army behind them, armor gleaming, voices thunderous. The people of Judah were caught between fear for their crops and fear for their lives, stuck right in the middle of one man's legendary mess. Rumors flew like startled birds. "He's done it now," whispered one elder, grip tight on his walking stick. "The Philistines aren't just angry at Samson, they'll punish us all for his trouble." The local wise woman, never one to mince words, declared, "A strong man is a blessing until he's the reason your roof might burn next." Parents kept children in. Merchants shut their doors early, and prayers drifted across the hills, some for safety, others secretly wishing Samson would just disappear for a while. Even the goats seemed nervous, as if they knew things seldom went calmly when Samson's shadow lingered on the horizon. When the Philistines demanded, "Hand over Samson or suffer his fate," the fear sharpened. The leaders of Judah gathered, voices hushed and eyes darting. "We didn't ask for this fight," one muttered. "Yet here we are hostage to a hero." It was no small irony. The one chosen by God to begin saving Israel had become their greatest liability. They looked to the high rocks where Samson had retreated, weighing loyalty against the need for peace. If only someone sighed, his strength came with an off switch. Every heart felt heavy with the impossible task of choosing between one man's calling and everyone else's safety. In truth, Judah's greatest fear wasn't just the Philistine army or scorched grain. It was discovering how little control they had over the fate tangled up in a single, stubborn, God-marked life. 3,000 men from Judah, number so large, it sounded like the punchline to a joke no one wanted to hear, climbed the rocky hill where Samson sat, lost in his thoughts. They marched with caution, not swords drawn but hands raised, carrying ropes instead of weapons. No one volunteered for the front. Being the messenger between legend and angry army was nobody's idea of a good day. When they reached him, Samson looked at their faces and saw dread, not anger. They shuffled and stammered, unsure how to ask the strongest man among them to surrender himself for the sake of peace. One finally found the nerve. "Samson, you know we don't have a choice. The Philistines want you, not us. If we resist, they'll burn it all down." Samson, ever the outsider, managed something like a smile, half velvet, half steel. So, you've come to arrest the one person fighting our enemies. Their shame burned on their faces. If we don't, we'll all pay. He'd always known that being the exception sometimes meant being the sacrifice. He nodded. Fine. Swear to me you won't kill me yourselves. They agreed, eager, relieved, and maybe a little surprised. They bound him in ropes, layers and layers, as if numbers alone could keep a legend still. Even tied, Samson dwarfed them by presence, if not by logic. As they led him down from the rock, murmurs rose among the crowd. Some whispered, he brought this on himself. Others wondered what it felt like to be both hero and problem, chosen and cast out in the very same breath. Samson let them lead him quietly, the ropes biting his skin, but not nearly as sharply as the realization that sometimes even your own will hand you over if it means saving themselves. That day, Samson learned what all outcasts know. To be set apart is to be set up, standing alone while everyone else shields themselves with your shadow. It should have been the end. Samson, tie D up like a festival goat, handed over to the Philistine army cheering, jeering, certain their troubles were over. The parade of victory barely started before Samson's ropes, as if sensing the absurdity, snapped like thread. All around, Philistine warriors closed in, blades raised and vengeance glinting in their eyes. Samson's gaze fell to the ground, where a discarded donkey's jawbone lay half buried in the dust. Of all weapons, it was neither polished nor poetic, just the leftover grin from someone else's story. He picked it up, swung it once, felt the weight, smiled to himself. Well, he muttered, when in doubt, improvise. What followed can only be described as chaos with choreography. Warriors rushed, and one by one fell not to a sword, but to a farm tool and a man who truly had nothing left to lose. The shouts turned quickly to the thud of defeat. 100, then 2, until 1,000 Philistine fighters lay scattered like so many broken plans. Somewhere in the midst of flying fists and startled cries, Samson tossed out a line with a donkey's jawbone. I've made donkeys of them. There's no record of whether it drew a laugh or a groan. He was a crowd of one by the end, anyway. When the dust settled, Samson stood alone, panting and bruised, fists slippery with the effort of survival and a little bit of satisfaction. He tossed the jawbone aside, the field quieter than a Sabbath morning after the rain. In that moment, with sarcasm on his lips and the absurdity of be at all lingering in the air, Samson reminded the world, real strength isn't about the weapons you choose, but the grit and wit you bring to the fight. Even in ruin, with the whole world against him, he found a way, one unexpected victory at a time. Victory has a strange aftertaste, especially when it is mingled with the dust and sweat of an impossible fight. Samson, once surrounded by 1,000 roaring enemies, found himself now standing utterly alone. No cheers, no grateful crowd, just silence. Punctuated by the pounding of his own heart. His arms trembled, knees buckled, and a thirst unlike any he'd known pressed down on him, heavier than any enemy's blow. He looked around at the barren field and let out a weary laugh. So this is what triumph feels like, Samson muttered, licking cracked lips. You teach the world a lesson, and all it gives you back is dust. Slumping to his knees, strength draining in waves, he called out to God, not with bravado, but the fragility only true exhaustion inspires. Lord, you gave your servant this victory. Will you really let me die of thirst now, after all this? The old Samson would have grouched, maybe boasted, or joked his way through the pain. But here, reduced to hunger and need, he simply asked because even the strongest man sometimes needs to be reminded he is not enough on his own. Almost before the prayer faded, Water burst from a hollow in the ground, sweet and clear as hope itself. Samson drank, relief flooding through his veins, as fatigue melted away. There, cradled by mercy, he realized his might alone had never been the story. Survival was less about muscle, more about surrender, less about what he could do, and more about who had held him up when all else was spent. In that silent, sacred pause, Samson found it's often in the emptiest moments, the ones after the hardest battles, when even sarcasm falls flat, that true dependence on God begins. And though he rose shakily, still stained by combat and consequence, summit hing softer now rested in him, the knowledge that thirst can become a doorway, and weakness a place where God is never far away. For a long season after the chaos and the clamor, Samson's world quieted. He became a judge in Israel, respected, feared, but always at arm's length. People streamed in with disputes and quarrels, hoping the legend would solve their troubles with a word or, if needed, a show of strength. Samson's decisions carried weight. His presence settled arguments no one else could touch. Yet the air around him was strangely empty. He built no lasting friendships, just layers of stories and boundaries harder than any boulder he'd ever budged. Sometimes, neighbors would nod politely and children would peek around corners, but true laughter avoided his company, as if even joy felt it might be crushed under the weight of all that history. There were no dinner invitations, no shared campfires with friends who asked how his day had truly gone. At night, as the moon painted tea, stones, silver and shadows stretched across silent homes, Samson wandered alone. In the cool hush, he'd watch families gather, light from their windows spilling into the streeter world he could glimpse, but never quite enter. He spoke to God in these stretches of stillness, his prayers less like speeches now, and more like flickers of longing. Sometimes, he whispered, "Is this what strength was for?" Other times, he let the quiet answer for him, layering question atop question until the silence itself became his companion. None challenged him, none truly knew him. In the hush between sunrise and sunset, Samson encountered the kind of loneliness only heroes learn about. The ache you get from being everyone's answer and nobody's friend. It was a chapter with little noise, but beneath the stillness, his soul kept searching for something more than strength, for a place to simply belong. If ever there was a man determined to learn things the hard way, it was Samson. The quiet of his instead of softening him, made his restless spirit itch all the more. He didn't mend his ways, at least, not in any way that made the elders nod in approval. No, Samson walked his own road, a twisting path marked by risks, passions, and a stubborn refusal to do what everyone expected. He moved through the nights like a rumor, wandering where he pleased, and keeping company that raised more than a few disapproving brows. Foreign women, forbidden by law and common sense alike, caught his attent. Ion, as surely as honey draws bees. If there was a line engraved in the sand, Samson was the one kicking dust over it, or dancing just beyond it, a private smirk lighting his eyes. "Why do you seek trouble?" An old friend tried to ask him one evening, voice low with genuine concern. Samson just shrugged, a half-sad, half-playful glint in his gaze. Some men chase peace, others are chased by the noise in their own hearts. He made bold choices, many fueled by desire or the thrill of defiance, and each one tangled his life a bit further. The people muttered, the leaders wrung their hands, but no one dared truly challenge him. After all, how do you reason with someone who can tear city gates from their hinges, then carry them off just to prove a point? Underneath the bravado, perhaps a softer ache pulsed a longing never named, an emptiness he kept tucked behind every reckless adventure. But Samson wore his turmoil like a well-fitting cloak, daring the world to judge him and daring himself to run faster than consequence. So he drifted, drawn by passions that never lasted, and choices that always cost more than they promised. Even a mighty judge can stumble, especially one intent on never walking the straight and narrow, preferring instead the wild, winding ways of a heart that refuses to settle. Samson's life rarely moved quietly, and one night in Gaza made sure everyone remembered it. He'd slipped into the city under cover of darker visit, born of the same restless hunger that now defined his days. The Philistines spotted him, of course, their spies quicker than rumors and twice as persistent. "Samson is here," they whispered, locking the city gates and plotting an ambush by morning. Most men would worry, or at least lose some sleep, knowing a city's worth of enemies was waiting outside. Not Samson. As darkness hung thick, he bided his time until midnight, then rose and stretched as if to say, "Let's make this interesting." He strode to the city gates, the very symbol of Gaza's pride and security, and with a grin, sank his hands into the heavy wood and iron. Muscles straining, sandals grinding into the stone, he tore the entire entrance from the wall's posts, bars, and all. Anyone awake at that hour might have thought themselves dreaming, seeing the city's gates hoisted onto Samson's back as if he were out for a stroll with firewood. He didn't just drop them at the nearest corner. Oh no, Samson carried those gates all the way up to a hill facing Hebron, a journey that turned Gaza's strongest defense into a public monument to their own embarrassment. "Try locking me in," he seemed to say, breathless from the climb but satisfied. "Or out. It hardly matters." By morning, word fluttered from rooftop to well. Samson had escaped, and Gaza was left gaping like a toothless lion. Pride may love a fortress, but Samson, well, he loved reminding everyone, friend and foe alike, that some walls are only as strong as the man who decides they don't apply to him. That eyed laughter followed him up the hill, and even the moon must have marveled at how one man's defiance could turn the bravest city into a punchline. Just when it seemed that all the chaos and daring escapes might finally tire Samson out, a new chapter opened. A whisper of perfume, a flicker of a smile, and the name Delilah slipping into every conversation. She arrived on the scene with mystery in her gaze and cleverness in every word. Where others saw danger, Samson saw only fascination. It was as if every fire and riddle had led to this moment, the one woman as complicated and magnetic as himself. Delilah was neither overawed by rumors nor put off by Samson's infamous past. She was the kind to ask questions so many, in fact, that even the village gossips felt exhausted trying to keep up. "How are you so strong, Samson?" she would ask, voice sweet but eyes glinting like a cat's at twilight. "Where does your secret come from? Tell me, if only so I can marvel at you properly." Of course. The Philistine rulers watched from the shadows, all too eager to use Delilah's charm for their own ends. They promised her silver a fortune, really, if she could uncover the secret to Samson's strength. It wasn't the first time someone tried to trap him, but Delilah made every question feel like a caress, and every conversation a dance. Samson wove between her curiosity and his own longing, delighting in her wit even as he sidestepped her intent. At night, as laughter mingled with whispered questions, Delilah played her part to perfection. One moment, she teased him with affection. The next, her questions circled back, sly and persistent. Beneath every smile, Samson sensed both the thrill of romance and the edge of danger. It was a game played by two stubborn hearts, one determined to guard a mystery, the other determined to claim it, curiosity beaming beneath every charming word. The stakes grew with every encounter, secrets hanging invisible in the air, passion and danger wrapped guilty as a knot. and still, the world watched, knowing that with each new question, the story spun itself closer to the point where truth would collide, spectacularly, with trust. Delilah was nothing if not persistent. Night after night, she charmed, cajoled, and nudged Samson a little closer to his secret. Each time, her questions danced between affection and ambition, her eyes soft, her smile practiced, her laughter like music seasoned with mischief. "Tell me, Samson, what makes you so strong?" he whispered once, tracing circles on his palm as if strength might leak through his skin. Samson grinned and spun a tale. "If I were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings, I would be as weak as any other man." Delilah wasted no time, passing along the tip to her waiting conspirators. But when the Philistines sprang from their hiding place, Samson snapped the cords like melting wax. Unfazed, Delilah smoothed her hair and teased, "You don't trust me. Where is your love?" Samson rolled his eyes but laid along. "Try new ropes that have never been used. That should do it." She tried. The Philistines tried. And again disaster for her, defeat for them. A third night came, and Delilah coaxed, "Surely you won't deceive me again." Samson upped the drama, spinning yet another half-truth. "Weave the 7 locks of my hair into the loom, and fasten it tight. Then I will be as any man." As the loom pulled and tugged, Samson simply pulled free, strands falling like a promise only half kept. Still, Delilah did not retreat. She put on her most wounded look, the one great actresses would envy. "How can you say you love me and keep secrets of your own?" Whether Samson believed in love or just enjoyed the game, he could not resist the tug of her voice, or maybe he only pretended not to see where things were headed. For 4 rounds, he played and she plotted, love and betrayal locked in a dance as old as time itself. Samson might have called it devotion, or maybe he just liked pressing his luck. Either way, Delilah's patience was growing thin, and her questions, like sharpened arrows, were flying ever closer to their mark. In the end, even the strongest heart can grow weary. Delilah, with her gentle words and dogged determination, wore Samson down bit by bit, a river working away at stubborn stone. Her pleading didn't stop, not for a single breath. "If you really loved me, you wouldn't keep secrets. You trust your fists more than you trust my heart. Am I just another riddle to you?" Samson, heavy with exhaustion and wrapped in her arms, found it strangely peaceful to give in. Maybe it was relief, maybe resignation, or maybe he simply wanted the ache to stop for a moment. With his head in Delilah's lap and the world narrowed to the hush of her voice, he finally whispered the truth neither of them could unhear. "No razor has ever touched my head," he said, the words slow and burdened, "for I am set apart from birth, dedicated to God. If my hair is shaved, all my strength will leave me, and I'll be as weak as any other man." Delilah's eyes flickered with triumph, though she masked it quickly with another soft caress. "Thank you, beloved," she murmured, though the silence that followed was more ominous than sweet. Samson drifted to sleep on her lap at last, too tired to keep fighting shadows and secrets. Even a giant sometimes just wants to rest, to believe in gentle hands, even if deep down he knows the danger. Delilah slipped away quietly to deliver the secret. Our steps barely making a sound as she moved from love's embrace to the clinking promise of silver. For all his strength, Samson had no answer for persistence, for loneliness, for the kind of longing that chooses comfort over caution. As sleep overcame him, he showed the world what nobody likes to admit. Even legends reach their limit, and even the strongest fall, tired us, especially when they're tired of standing alone. Nothing stings quite like betrayal uncovered at your most vulnerable. With Samson, deep in sleephead in Delilah's lap, trust as fragile as glass, the room filled with the quiet snip of scissors, each pass slicing away not just hair, but every promise and hope tied up in those locks. It was almost comical, in a tragic sort of way. The world's strongest man, laid low by something as ordinary as shears. Each strand that drifted to the floor carried a bit of his past, his calling, his confidence. Gone was the wild mane that once made children stare and enemies shudder. In its place, Ace were sharp whispers, the soft mockery of those who'd been waiting for this fall. The mighty Samson, now not so mighty, slumped and helpless as the morning light found him. Delilah called for the Philistines, her voice smooth as honey twisted on a blade. With his hair stolen and his trust shattered, Samson woke to hands gripping, laughter jeering, and the sickening realization that sometimes the hardest blow comes not from a sword, but from disappointment you never saw coming. He tried to ache off his captors as before, but strength didn't answer. His arms, once capable of shifting mountains and breaking ropes like thread, now felt ordinary, awkward, useless. The Philistines whooped with triumph at last. The man who terrified whole armies was broken by a woman, a secret, and a pair of scissors. They dragged Samson out, a spectacle for everyone to see. His shame was paraded through the streets, former legend reduced to a cautionary tale. Children gawked, elders whispered, so much for destiny, and through it all, Samson bowed his head, feeling the eyes of the world upon him not with awe, but with that sharp sting of public failure. Strength gone, hope slipping away with every lost lock, he learned what every hero dreads, that sometimes the real battle is the one you lose when everyone's watching. Triumph for the Philistines had always seemed a distant dream, some wild hope to be whispered over campfires. Yet here it was, real as the chains they clamped around Samson's wrists and ankles. He, who'd once been the shadow in every Philistine nightmare, now stumbled blindly beside his captors, his eyes burned away by revenge disguised as victory. No sword or army had managed what a pair of scissors and a handful of silver had accomplished. The celebration was loud, voices sharp and triumphant, boasting of a victory won without a single honest fight. Samson, once a whirlwind of muscle and will, now trudged forward with the numb shuffle of the defeated. Where crowds once parted before him, they now pressed close to gawk. Where awe once filled every corner he entered, now there was only jeering, laughter, and the certain knowledge that even the greatest can fall. They led him not to a cell, but to a grinding mill, his colossal hands now condemned to the simple, endless turning of stone on grain. Sunlight and shadows passed unnoticed. He moved in darkness, and not just for lack of sight. The world shrunk to the rough touch of wood and stone, the ache of clays working without hope, and the echo of every mistake repeating in his mind. How the mighty have fallen, someone smirked, as if he needed the reminder. Sometimes he thought he heard Delilah's voice, or the voices of his parents, or the laughter of children from before all the riddles and heartbreak. Memory became his only company in the night, regret stealing all comfort from even the briefest rest. There, at the lowest pointer, hero ground down to nothing, Samson tasted the bitter dregs, humiliation, and wondered if anyone, even God, could find something worth saving in a story this shattered. And so the champion of Israel became the punchline in Philistine victory songs, the bearer of chains and darkness, finally reaching the place where only broken prayers are spoken. There is a silence that goes beyond noise, past the scrape of chains or the shouts of guards. It is the hush that comes when someone has truly lost everything, the kind that settles deep, making itself at home in the empty corners of a soul. In the darkness of the prison, Samson learned that silence intimately, no chatter of neighbors, no laughter from feasts, Not even the taunts of enemies could fill the emptiness left by what had been taken. The days followed each other, all the same. The grind of the mill, the ache that crept up his arms, the monotony broken only by the echo of memories he wished he could forget. Samson measured time not in hours, but in what he had lost: his sight, his strength, his purpose, and, above all, the sense that God was near. What use is muscle and might when your world shrinks to the reach of your own hands in the dark? Sometimes, he whispered, is anyone still listening? But the only answer was the scrape of stone, the weight of the shackles, and the steady, aching truth that both freedom and forgiveness seemed impossibly far away. At night, Samson curled against the cold wall, wondering how a life filled with so much promise could narrow into this single, silent cell. He searched his heart for what he might still offer, but all he found were regrets and the dim flicker of a hope too stubborn to be smothered. Deep in this silence, a silence that was both punishment and possibility, Samson waited. He had lost his people, his pride, and every ounce of public honor. Yet there, in the darkness, stripped of every illusion, the strongest man in the world was forced to learn what strength is truly made of. And sometimes, as his breath slowed and the noise faded, a small, nearly forgotten prayer would rise, a question, a trembling word, a beginning no one else could hear. Change, when it finally comes, is rarely loud. In the hush of his prison one day, bleeding quietly into the next, something small began to shift for Samson. He didn't notice it at first. Who would notice a single hair, a stray wisp against the neck, when every muscle aches and the world is darkness? But in time, as his hands ran over his scalp, he felt what was lost returning grain by grain, strand by stubborn strand. His hair began to grow. It came back slowly, not with urgency or fanfare, but with the determined patience of grass, stubbornly breaking through stone. The guards, so certain of their victory, barely paid attention. After all, what threat was a blind and broken man, turning grain in the shadows? Yet for Samson, each curl and tangle became a quiet promise, the memory of who he had been, and the gentle stirring of who he might still be. The chains on his hands remained, but something inside him started to feel a little less heavy. Hope, timid as a young sparrow, fluttered around the edges. It made no grand entrance. It simply perched within, waiting for him to notice. Sometimes, as he worked and the world forgot about him, Samson would pause. A whisper nudged his spirit, not the parade of pride, but the persistent voice that brushes past shame and regret. Perhaps, it murmured, the story is not over. Perhaps God remembers even here. The old string did not roar back like a lion. It hummed gently, hidden beneath the surface, growing with every day that his hair did. For every memory that stung, there was now a shadow of promise. Who you are is not always what you've lost. Even in the silence and the shadows, life may be readying a new beginning. And so, unnoticed by the guards and unguessed by his captors, hope took root, again quiet, patient, growing as surely as the hair that crowned the head of a fallen giant. The day arrived when the Philistines threw a celebration so loud that even the dust seemed to dance. Their temple overflowed with laughter and boasts, wine and wild music, on in honor of their god, Dagon, whom they credited for Samson's downfall. In the midst of this noisy triumph, they summoned the man himself, their greatest enemy, now reduced to spectacle. Samson was led into the crowded temple, stumbling, guided by a boy's hand. The crowd surged, their gears ringing louder than any trumpet. "Bring out Samson," they shouted, eager for the chance to gloat over a living trophy. Blind and bruised, head bowed but hair quietly grown, Samson stood where the crowd could see him best. Every eye devoured his shame. The once mighty hero was now their proof. No one, not even the God of Israel, could withstand the Philistines. They called for him to perform, to amuse them, to mock himself for their delight. The laughter crashed around him, wave after wave. He stood in the torchlight, a symbol of surrender. But if an Yon had bothered to look closely, past the outward defeat, they might have noticed what the celebration, Mr. Quiet determination, growing with every jeer. A flicker in the tilt of his head, a purpose rekindling where pride had once lived. For now, though, Samson was the centerpiece of their feast, a man paraded not for his strength, but for the deliciousness of his humiliation. He was their triumph made visible, the punchline to a joke years in the making. The Philistines cheered, the temple swayed with victory, and above it all, Samson waited in silence, knowing that the world loves nothing more than to display a fallen hero, never imagining that there might still be another act to come. Among the noise and flashing smiles of the Philistine festival, there were two kinds of eyes that followed Samson, curious and cruel. The children pressed forward, pulling each other by the wrists, gazing up at the big, broken figure in the torchlight. They had heard wild stories about him, how he Ents bested armies, carried city gates, and made riddles that tied grown men in knots. Now, with his hands bound and sight gone, he looked nothing like the monster in their bedtime tales. "Is that really Samson?" one whispered, the question part awe, part puzzle. "He looks tired," said another, tugging on his friend's sleeve. "Not a hero, not a villain, just a man who stood quiet and strange while the grown-ups laughed." The adults were very different. Their eyes were hard, lips curled upward in proud disgust. Many remembered the terror he brought, the fields he set ablaze, the nights spent in whispering fear. Seeing him here famous, mane-shorn, dignity stripped away, led by a child they found in his ruin an easy comfort, they mocked him out loud, whispering too, always loud enough for Samson to hear. "So this is the great enemy," scoffed one, reduced to a sideshow for children. Others collected each insult like a souvenir, tossing cheap jests at him as though words themselves could anchor their victory. Through it all, Samson stood alone. The giggles of the children were softer, the scorn of the adults sharp as salt. Neither group knew the weight he carried, the children too small for such burdens, the adults too certain their day would never end. In their eyes, he was nothing more than a warning or a punchline. In his silence, Samson heard it all, the laughter, the contempt, and the echoes of all he once was, shuffling dimly beneath a roof grown heavy with pride. Surrounded by ridicule and torchlight, Samson withdrew into himself, far from the clamor of the Philistine revelers, far from even the curious gazes of children. In the hollow hush of his mind, he wandered back through all that had been lost and all that might have been. Each memory surfaced like a stone in a river. The promise announced before his birth, his mother's gentle prayers, the laughter of a youth a little too strong and a little too lonely. Every regret sharpened as he remembered choices made Ashley, battles fought for pride or impulse, the ache of friends never gained, and the warmth of trust too quickly given away. He thought of the riddle at his wedding feast, and the sweetness of honey drawn from a lion's carcass. All those moments that had once seemed filled with destiny now flickered with a kind of sorrow. What might have bloomed if only he'd been a different sort of man. Recollections of love, too heavy with complication, tenderness, stolen away as quickly as it was found. Delilah's soft voice echoed, "If you loved me, you'd trust me with your secret." He pictured his parents' hopeful faces the day he was born, weighed down by the knowledge that his calling had become a cautionary tale. Beneath all this ran a current of mourning, not just for his eyes or his strength, but for the invisible futures that would never arrive. There was a pain deeper than punishment in Samson, the knowledge of roads untaken, gifts wasted, courage misapplied, anger warred with grief, and summit. He heard his own voice whisper, if only ... Yet something remained, even in the gloom, a longing for redemption, a faint, trembling wish that this story, misstepped and marred, might still be gathered up and made whole. For now, though Samson drowned in memories both sweet and sharp, carried along by the ache of what was and all he could never reclaim, in the roaring stillness of the Philistine temple, Samson stood a drifter, man once shaped by strength, now shrouded in darkness and absence. Blindness filled his world, the echoes of song, jeers, and distant laughter pressing in on every side. As he listened to the celebration swirl around him, he felt the loneliness that comes not just from being alone, but from being the only one who remembers what is missing. He reached out, hands trembling slightly as they brushed rough stone and cool marble, searching for anything solid in a world gone uncertain. His fingers grazed the thick pillars that upheld the roof above the columns, carved and polished by unfamiliar hands, indifferent to his suffering. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his palms pressed against them, feeling the grooves and weight, the unmoving proof that he truly had nowhere left to run. There was a heaviness, not just overhead, but within him, a sense of loss that filled every hollow place. So much slipped through his grasp: promise, love, laughter, and all the quiet hopes that once hummed like background music. In the space between columns, Samson let the silence expand inside him, a vacuum where pride had toppled, and all his grand designs had faded to dim echoes. Children's laughter flickered on the edges of his hearing, quickly replaced by the mockery of men convinced of their victory. His heart beat slow and steady, thumping out the truth he had tried to deny for years. There was nothing left for him here, nothing left at all at perhaps one final prayer, and the chance, however small, to do something that mattered one last time. Is still moment. His hands found their anchor, and his soul knew both the weight of loss and, deep beneath it, the glimmering edge of resolve. Alone between the pillars, feeling the press of stone and the greater weight of regret, Samson finally let his pride loosen its hold. No clever riddles, no witty retorts, just the stripped-down honesty of a heart that had come to its end. Beneath the noise of the crowd and the distant, haunting echoes of old failures, a prayer rose, soft as morning dew. Lo, Adi God, remember me, he whispered. The words came out small, rough with need, transparent as water. I know I am nothing on my own. All my strength couldn't keep me safe, couldn't keep me wise, couldn't keep me true. But if you're still there just for a moment, turn to me again. He did not ask for glory, nor try to bargain away his shame. He only let himself be seen lost, weary, and wanting to be held in memory even after all that had gone wrong. Strengthen me just once more, Samson breathed, into the stone, not for revenge or pride, but because I have nowhere else to go. Please, let this last act bring meaning, if not to me, then for your people. It wasn't grand, and it wasn't pretty. It was the kind of prayer that doesn't echo but seeps quiet as hope into the deepest part of the soul. For the first time, Samson's strength was not the centerpiece his need was, and as humbling as it felt, it was also the truest thing he had left to offer. He did not know if anyone heard. Maybe That's what faith truly is, trusting that the one who formed you remembers your name, even in darkness, even after everything falls apart. So Samson prayed, arms spread against the pillars, holding nothing but humility and a hope that this, at last, would be enough. In the heart of the temple, while drums thundered and voices rang out in hollow celebration, Samson lingered in a hush the crowd would never notice. Between sobs, muffled by the noise, he opened his heart wide, no walls left, no clever words to hide behind, just the ache and hope of a soul returned to its maker. He felt the salt of tears on his cheeks, unseen but not unnoticed. I failed more than I conquered, didn't I? He confessed, as if the darkness itself were listening. I held so tightly to what I thought I needed, forgetting where any strength ever really came from. Still you're here, aren't you, even now? No voice thundered down from the heavens, but in the silence, something gentle and steady settled within him. Reasons unfazed by disgrace or distance, as familiar as childhood and as vast as eternity. Samson inhaled shakily, sensing his sorrow received and his longing neither dismissed nor scolded. "Thank you," he whispered, "not just for strength, but for staying, even while I wandered so far away." In that last, silent exchange, shame loosened its grasp, and mercy so long overshadowed by bravado crept into light the dim places of his soul. Samson leaned into the pillars as if to embrace the God he owled not see, feeling known in the kind of way that goes deeper than victory, pain, or reputation. Ancient promises and unfailing love wove themselves through the last tears of a broken man no longer abandoned, but finally found. It wasn't the strength in his arms that mattered now, but the openness of his spirit, reaching upward one last time, between breaths, between beats of the heart. A secret dialogue hummed a reconciliation, written not in words, but in the quiet closeness that only comes when everything else falls away and nothing remains but grace. With the weight of the temple pressing down and the whole of his life gathered inside his heart, Samson prayed as he never had before, not for applause, not for revenge, not even for rescue. He asked for strength with trembling humility. "Lord, let me feel your power just once more," he pleaded. "Not for my name or my pride, but because I want this story to mean something greater than its mistakes. I want the end to honor the calling you gave me, to remember your people, even if all they remember of me is how I finished." His hands gripped the pillars, old scars and calluses pressing into unyielding stone. The crowd still roared, lost in their own triumph, oblivious to the quiet reckoning unfolding in their midst. Samson did not thirst for victory. He was not chasing the shadow of his old feats. Instead, he aimed his final breath at redemption, hoping to pull something holy out of so many broken pieces. He looked upward, with eyes that could see, but with a spirit cracked wide open. "Let this last act clear the dust from my story. Let my weakness carry your strength. In this moment, O God, let me be yours completely, finally, and truly." There was no thunder to mark the moment, no divine spotlight shining down, just a man, battered but not abandoned, asking that his life, its faults and failures, might be carried by grace rather than buried by shame. In that plea, Samson found a strange peace. With his final Raya, he placed his story back in God's hands, not because he had been the greatest, but because even a flawed ending can become an offering when faith is all that remains. And sometimes, the mightiest strength is found in a heart willing, at last, to be remade. There is a moment, quiet at first, when faith and courage meet muscle and memory, and the world holds its breath. For Samson, that moment bloomed as he braced himself against the pillars, letting his prayer linger in the hush behind show, oots, and laughter. The great temple, built by pride and crowded with those who thought themselves victorious, waited and aware that hope sometimes arrives disguised as a defeated man. With a steady inhale, Samson heaved. The columns beneath his hands shuddered, ancient stone protesting as if surprised to find itself in a story not yet finished. The ground trembled, The music faltered, replaced by gasps and the sudden, sharp panic of a crowd feeling power shift beneath their feet. The pillars cracked, stones splintering like the closing of a wound. Dust rained from above. Sunlight pierced through fractures in the roof. Someone shouted a warning, a prayer, or maybe just disbelief. The walls and roof, so sure of their own strength, began to move, tilting and leaning toward collapse. Samson, blind and battered, became the axis. His strength surged not from pride, but from promise. The last reserves of hope flooding through his arms. "Let it be enough," he whispered to the God who heard him. And then the temple fell. The crash thundered through Gaza, stone and timber spilling in every direction. The laughter and scorn snuffed out in a single, breathtaking instant. Enemies and mockers, the mighty and the mighty impressed, were swept up in the ruin. In his final act, Samson pulled down both the temple and the curtain on an era of humiliation, making a monument not to his strength, but to a faith rediscovered in the tremble of the earth, in the quiet between heartbeats, in the surrender beneath the rubble. History would remember the power, but heaven marked the heart, a faith that held on, even as the walls gave way. When the dust settled and the noise drained from the air, a deep and sacred quiet settled over the ruins. The cheers and laughter of Samson's enemies had vanished in a heartbeat, replaced now by the hush that follows the closing of a great chapter. Underneath crushed stone and shattered pride, Samson rested in a peace born not from victory, but from letting lingered at the edges of his last breath, the mistakes relived one final time, the sorrow for roads untraveled and hearts he'd hurt along the way. Yet, woven through the ache was a hope gentle as dawn. Samson knew his ending was not the story he'd dreamed as a boy, but in those final moments he was not lost. With humility in his heart and forgiveness brushing the dust from his soul, a surprising peace anchored him where glory once faltered. No more running, no more riddles, no more roving himself. The world, for a fleeting instant, paused in reverence for a man whose strength was only ever a hint of something deeper. In the silence after the fall, Samson's story was gathered up by the one who had set it in motion, each broken piece carried with care. There, under the toppled temple and the gaze of both strangers and angels, Samson went home not in disgrace, but in the hope that even a life full of failure can be stitched together again by mercy. Even in parting the Demon left behind not just the ruins of his enemies, but seeds of faith that tough times and tangled hearts could not uproot. In that great quiet, a wandering soul found rest, wrapped in the peace of being known, forgiven, and remembered not for the columns he toppled, but for the surrender that let God have the last, gentle word. So here, at the end of Samson's winding story, we're left with a new understanding of strength, one that isn't measured by what you can lift or break, but by why you can begin again after everything has fallen apart. True power is not in muscles or in dazzling successes, but in the gentle courage to return with humility when pride is gone and hope seems dried out. Samson's life reminds us that even those chosen for greatness stumble. Heroes are sometimes most human when they are most broken. Yet grace is clever, it finds its way through the cracks in our stories, building something meaningful from the dust of our regrets. Tonight, as you lay your rudons down, imagine that quiet settling in the kind that came over the ruins when Samson's striving finally ceased. Let that peace wrap around you, soft as a lullaby sung from the heart of heaven. No matter how tangled your day, how noisy the world, there is always a rest waiting when we let go, trust, and simply breathe. If the world sees only your flaws, know that God delights in gathering up every piece, weaving purpose even out of missteps. Hope, like Samson's hair, grows again quietly, patently, even in darkness, when you least expect it. So close your eyes, friend. Set down every weight. Let the silence bless you with its gentle promise. You are not alone. Your story is not over, and new beginnings often germinate in places where you thought there was only an ending. May hope find you, and may strengths off and slow rise up again within you as you rest. Thank you for being here for this story. If these gentle reflections touch your heart, feel free to leave a word for others, or to return for another peaceful journey. Until then, may your night be filled with the hush of peace, and your days with the quiet, resilient joy of hope rediscovered.